They called it a turkey when they saw it lumbering toward combat for the first time. May 31st, 1943, 27,000 feet above the Russell Islands in the Solomon Chain. Japanese Ace Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, veteran of 217 sorties, watched through his gun sight as a new American fighter climbed into formation, its stubby wings and fat fuselage making it look more like a freight hauler than a killing machine. He'd heard whispers through intelligence channels about this new Grumman design, but seeing it now, silhouetted against the Pacific blue, he felt only contempt. The American Wildcat had been predictable, exploitable, a bird with clipped wings that Japanese pilots had learned to dissect in the first year of war. This bloated successor looked even worse. Sakai's wingman laughed over the radio, a crackling, dismissive sound that echoed through four cockpits of the Imperial Navy's finest Zero pilots. "More meat for the grinder," the voice said in Japanese. "Look how it wallows through the sky like a pregnant cow." What Lieutenant Sakai didn't know, what none of them could have known as they positioned for their attack run, was that inside those ugly wings sat 6 Browning M250 caliber machine guns loaded with 400 rounds each, 2,400 rounds of armor-piercing incendiary ammunition capable of delivering 100 projectiles per second into anything foolish enough to enter their cone of fire. He didn't know that beneath that fat fuselage sat 2,000 pounds of Pratt and Whitney double Wasp engine, generating more horsepower than 3 of his Squadron Zeros combined. He didn't know that the pilot he was about to bounce, a farm kid from Iowa with 43 hours of Hellcat training, had more flight time in the past 6 weeks than Sakai's entire replacement squadron would receive in the next 6 months. And he certainly didn't know that the F6F Hellcat he was dismissing as a turkey would, in the next 24 months, destroy 5,156 Japanese aircraft, achieve a kill ratio of 19-1, and become the single most lethal fighter platform in the history of naval warfare. The mathematics of Japan's doom were loaded in those wings. Saburo Sakai was 30 seconds away from understanding exactly what American industrial fury looked like when it decided to stop playing defense. The Hellcat wasn't born from inspiration. It was born from desperation wrapped in American pragmatism, the kind of engineering philosophy that says if something can absorb punishment and keep killing, make it bigger and give it more guns. In late 1940, while the Wildcat was still proving itself against European adversaries, the United States Navy approached Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation with a problem. The Vought F4U Corsair, their golden child next-generation fighter, with its inverted gull wing and promised performance specifications, was experiencing what military bureaucrats politely called issues. What they actually meant was that the Corsair had visibility problems that made carrier landing somewhere between suicidal and impossible, and the Navy needed an insurance policy before their entire carrier fighter program became a smoking crater of failed procurement. Grumman's chief designer, Leroy Grumman, and his engineering lead, Bob Hall, didn't waste time with elegant solutions or revolutionary thinking. They looked at the Wildcat, looked at combat reports streaming back from Navy pilots who'd engaged Zeros over Wake Island and Coral Sea, and asked a simple question: what if we took everything that works, made it bigger, gave it more power, and wrapped it in enough armor that pilots could fly home with half the airplane shot away? The result was a design philosophy that would have made a European aeronautical engineer weep, where the Mitsubishi Zero sacrificed everything for maneuverability and climb rate, stripping away armor and self-sealing fuel tanks to chase performance. The Hellcat embraced weight like a religion. 212 pounds of cockpit armor plate, self-sealing fuel tanks that could take 20mm cannon fire and keep feeding the engine. A fuselage structure so overbuilt that one Hellcat returned to the USS Essex with a 5-foot section of wing missing, and the pilot casually reported it flew a bit heavy on one side. The first prototype, designated F6F flew on June 26, 1942, just under a year after the contract signature, powered by a Wright R2600 Cyclone engine producing 1,600 horsepower. It was fast, stable, and utterly conventional. Then Grumman did something that would define the Hellcat's legend. They ripped out the Cyclone and bolted in a Pratt & Whitney our 2800 Double Wasp generating 2,000 horsepower, the same engine that powered the troubled Corsair, and suddenly the insurance policy became a sledgehammer. The second prototype, F6F demonstrated a 30-mile-per-hour speed advantage over a captured Zero during comparison trials at Naval Air Station Anacostia. More importantly, it outrolled, and could sustain damage that would have disintegrated 3 Zeros. Navy test pilots came back from evaluation flights using words like stable, forgiving, and you could fly it drunk if you had to, which in naval aviation parlance translated to our 19-year-old kids won't kill themselves trying to land this thing on a carrier deck at night. Production began in October 1942 at Grumman's Bethpage, Long Island facility. And here's where American manufacturing superiority stopped being an abstract concept and became apocalyptic reality for the Japanese Empire. In the next 24 months, Grumman would manufacture 11,000 F6F Hellcats, averaging 15 aircraft per day at peak production. More fighters than Japan would produce across all types in the entire year of 1944. Each Hellcat rolled off the line with 650 caliber Browning machine guns arranged 3 per wing, synchronized to converge their fire pattern at 350 yards, creating a cone of destruction that could saw a Zero in half in under 2 seconds of sustained fire. The ammunition load was 400 rounds per gun, 2,400 rounds total, giving Hellcat pilots roughly 24 seconds of trigger time before Winchester, more than triple the firing duration of early Wildcats. And unlike the mixed armament headaches plaguing European fighters, trying to harmonize different ballistic trajectories of cannons and machine guns, every Hellcat gun fired the same round at the same velocity, simplifying training, maintenance, and the fundamental business of putting bullets into the enemy. What the Japanese Navy didn't understand yet, what their intelligence analysts couldn't quite process as Hellcats began appearing in squadron strength by mid-1943, was that America wasn't just building a better fighter. They were building an industrial avalanche, a production system that could absorb combat losses that would cripple any other nation and replace them before the paperwork hit headquarters. Japan had built the Zero as a masterpiece, each one a finely tuned instrument of aerial combat requiring skilled labor and precision manufacturing. America built the Hellcat like a tractor, overbuilt, simple to maintain, easy to fly, and absolutely unstoppable when you unleashed 12,000 of them into the Pacific theater with pilots who had more fuel for training than the Japanese had for combat operations. June 19, 1944, 0430 hours. Commander David McCampbell stood on the flight deck of USS Essex, watching the first hints of dawn paint the Philippine Sea in shades of purple and gold. He'd been a fighter pilot for 2 years, a squadron commander for 8 months, and in 20 minutes, he would lead his Hellcat squadron into what would become the most lopsided naval air battle in military history. Intelligence had reported a massive Japanese carrier strike inbound. Operation A-Go, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's desperate gamble to cripple the American Fast Carrier Task Force before the Marianas invasion became irreversible. McCampbell did the math in his head. His squadron had 36 Hellcats ready for launch. Across the task force, another 400 fighters sat on deck or in the air on combat air patrol. The Japanese were throwing everything they had left at this fight, and McCampbell knew with absolute certainty that most of them would never see their carriers again. Not because American pilots were braver or more skilled, though they were both, but because the Hellcat had turned aerial combat into an industrial process. You identified the target, closed to effective range, pressed the trigger, and watched physics do the rest. The first wave of Japanese aircraft appeared on radar at 0958 hours. 69 aircraft, a mixed formation of Zeros, Judas, and Jills, flying at 14,000 feet in a loose combat spread that would have been effective in 1942, but was now just target practice for Hellcat pilots with 2 years of training and unlimited ammunition. Commander McCampbell's squadron intercepted 30 miles out from the fleet, and what followed wasn't a dogfight in the traditional sense. It was an execution. Hellcats dove from altitude advantage, their superior speed and power allowing them to control engagement geometry absolutely. Those that tried to turn fight found Hellcats refusing the bait, extending away in shallow dives the Japanese fighters couldn't match, then reversing for another slashing attack. Japanese pilots who'd learned to exploit the Wildcat's sluggish roll rate discovered the Hellcat, snapped into and out of banks like a much smaller aircraft. All that horsepower and robust control surfaces giving American pilots options their predecessors never had. And when the .50 calibers opened up, the difference between American and Japanese damage tolerance became brutally apparent. Zero after zero disintegrated under bursts that would have merely wounded a Hellcat, their unarmored fuel tanks erupting into fireballs, their lightweight structures shedding wings and tails under punishment that American aircraft shrugged off routinely. Lieutenant Junior Grade Alex Vreeshuh, flying from USS Lexington, shot down 6 Japanese dive bombers in 8 minutes, his gun camera footage showing aircraft literally coming apart in midair as .50 caliber API rounds ignited fuel systems and severed control linkages. His radio call after the 6th kill was 3 words: "Hell, this is like an old-time turkey shoot." The name stuck. By 1300 hours, when the last Japanese aircraft either fell into the sea or retreated toward their carriers, the score was apocalyptic. 383 Japanese aircraft destroyed against 29 American losses, a kill ratio of 13-1, and most of the American losses came from accidents and operational mishaps, not enemy action. The Hellcat had done exactly what it was designed to do: absorb punishment, maintain formation integrity, and systematically dismantle an opponent that couldn't match American firepower, armor, or industrial replacement capacity. But the turkey shoot's real significance wasn't the numbers. It was what those numbers represented. Japan had thrown the last operational reserve of its naval air power into this battle. Pilots who represented years of training and irreplaceable combat experience. And America had swatted them from the sky like insects while losing less than 3% of its committed force. The Hellcat hadn't just won an engagement. It had erased an entire generation of Japanese naval aviation in one afternoon. Admiral Ozawa's carriers would make it back to Japan, but they would sail as floating museums, platforms without meaningful air wings, symbols of naval power that no longer existed. And the Hellcats that killed them would be back on deck by sunset, rearmed, refueled, and ready to do it again tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day until Japan stopped sending aircraft into the sky because there was nothing left to send. There's a reason the Hellcat looked ugly compared to its contemporaries. The Corsair had that aggressive bent wing profile that photographers loved. The P-51 Mustang had lines that suggested speed, even sitting still. The Hellcat looked like someone had taken a barrel, attached wings, and called it a day. But that aesthetic brutality concealed an engineering philosophy that would influence military aircraft design for the next 50 years. Battlefield effectiveness trumps elegance every single time. Roy Grumman had built his reputation on aircraft that brought pilots home, and the Hellcat represented the apotheosis of that principle. Every design decision prioritized survivability and operational effectiveness over performance specifications that looked good on paper. The fuselage was wide and deep because that created internal volume for fuel, ammunition, and structure without compromising the pilot's visibility or access. The wings were thick because thick wings could accommodate landing gear, fuel tanks, and weapon stations while providing the lift characteristics needed for carrier operations. The canopy was a simple blown shape because complex frameless designs were harder to manufacture, harder to replace in forward areas, and provided potential failure points under combat damage. The result was an aircraft that maintenance crews worshipped. A Hellcat could be rearmed, refueled, and relaunched in under 15 minutes by a competent deck crew. Routine maintenance that required specialized tools and trained technicians on other fighters could be handled with standard wrenches and common sense on a Hellcat. Battle damage that would ground other aircraft for days could be field repaired on a Hellcat in hours using materials available on any carrier. There are documented cases of Hellcats returning with hydraulic systems shot away, landing gear manually cranked down, canopies shattered, and elevator control reduced to cables and pulleys, and after 6 hours in the hangar deck, they were flying combat missions again. This wasn't luck. This was intentional design. Grumman engineers had looked at Pacific combat realities, 6,000 miles from the nearest industrial base, supply chains measured in weeks, and built an aircraft that could absorb the chaos of extended naval campaigns without becoming a hangar queen. But the Hellcat's real genius was how it matched pilot capabilities to aircraft performance. The Zero had been designed for elite pilots, experts who could exploit every ounce of maneuverability and climb performance. Take those experts away through attrition, replace them with minimally trained replacements, and the Zero became a death trap. The Hellcat was designed for average pilots having bad days. It was stable enough that a rookie could land it on a carrier deck without killing himself. It was forgiving enough that combat stress and fatigue didn't degrade performance to dangerous levels. And it was powerful enough that even an average pilot could generate lethal attack geometry against better maneuvering opponents. American training doctrine reinforced this advantage mercilessly. By 1944, the average Hellcat pilot arriving in theater had 400 hours of flight time, including extensive gunnery training, aerobatics, formation flying, and carrier qualification. Compare that to Japanese replacement pilots arriving with less than 100 hours total time and minimal gunnery experience, thrown into combat because there was no fuel for advanced training and no time to develop skills gradually. The Hellcat didn't just have better pilots. It had a pilot training pipeline that treated aerial combat as an industrial skill, something you could teach systematically to farm kids and city boys, turn them into adequate fighter pilots in 12 months, and replace losses faster than combat could create them. Japan couldn't match that. They'd started the war with superior pilots and comparable aircraft, but they'd built a system dependent on elite performance. And when the elites died over Midway and Guadalcanal, the system collapsed. America built a system dependent on adequate performance amplified by superior equipment. And when individual pilots died, the system kept functioning because there were 5 more kids in the training pipeline ready to take their place. The Hellcat was the physical manifestation of that philosophy. It wasn't the best fighter in any single performance metric. It was the best fighter for the war America was actually fighting. An industrial conflict of attrition where victory went to whoever could sustain operations across thousands of miles for years without degradation. Japan built art. America built a sledgehammer and swung it until nothing stood. Saburo Sakai survived the war. He was one of the fortunate ones, if you can call witnessing the systematic destruction of everything you trained for fortunate. In his post-war memoir, Samurai, published in 1957, he wrote about the first time he engaged a Hellcat in combat. I pulled into a firing position expecting the American pilot to maneuver to try to outturn me, as the Wildcats had always attempted. Instead, he simply rolled inverted and dove away, accelerating to speeds I could not match. I followed, pushing my Zero to its limits, and watched him extend the distance between us as if my aircraft was standing still. Then, at 3,000 meters, he reversed, and suddenly he was climbing back toward me with such speed and power that I had no choice but to break away. I realized then that we were no longer fighting the same war. The Americans had brought a new kind of combat to the Pacific, one where power and armor mattered more than agility, and we had no answer for it. That realization, that moment when a veteran of hundreds of sorties understood his experience had become obsolete, echoes through every Japanese pilot testimony from 1943 onward. They described the Hellcat not with tactical analysis, but with the language of inevitability, the way you might describe a natural disaster. Lieutenant Naoshi Kano, one of Japan's last surviving aces, recalled encountering Hellcats during the defense of the Philippines. We were told they were inferior to the Zero, that American pilots lacked fighting spirit, that our superior training would compensate for any material differences. These are lies told by commanders who had never faced what we faced in the sky. The Hellcat was not inferior. It was a machine built for killing, and it excelled at its purpose. When they attacked in pairs, one high and one low, there was no escape. If you turned to engage the lower aircraft, the higher one dove on you with overwhelming speed. If you try to climb away from the lower one, you exposed your belly to his guns, and he would simply extend, reverse, and kill you from below. We were not fighting pilots anymore. We were fighting a system, and the system was perfect. But the most damning testimony came from Japanese ground crews and engineers who examined capture Hellcats after the war. Commander Masatake Okimiya, who served as an engineering officer in the Imperial Navy, wrote in Zero, the story of Japan's air war in the Pacific. When I inspected a captured F6F at Yokosuka in 1945, I felt something close to despair. The quality of construction, the robustness of every system, the thought that had gone into making this aircraft maintainable under field conditions, it spoke to an industrial capacity we could never match. This was not a fighter built by technicians in a laboratory. This was a fighter built by a nation that understood war as a manufacturing problem and had solved it with terrifying efficiency. These weren't the words of cowards or incompetents making excuses. These were professionals acknowledging they'd been outthought, outbuilt, and out-resourced by an opponent who'd turned aerial warfare into something between a science and an assembly line process. The psychological impact of facing Hellcats went beyond simple fear of death. It was the realization that every loss Japan suffered was irreplaceable, while every Hellcat shot down was replaced by 3 more within a week. It was watching American formations grow larger each month, while Japanese formations shrank. It was understanding that skill and bravery meant nothing against an opponent who could absorb 10-to-1 loss ratios and still maintain air superiority because they were building fighters faster than Japan could train pilots to fly their own aircraft. By late 1944, Japanese tactical doctrine had essentially given up on defeating Hellcats in air-to-air combat. Orders shifted to avoiding engagement whenever possible, to preserving aircraft for kamikaze missions where at least the plane's destruction might damage an American ship. That wasn't adaptation. That was capitulation. When your fighter doctrine becomes, avoid the enemy fighter at all costs, you've already lost the air war. The Hellcat had achieved something rare in military history. It had broken the enemy's will to contest the medium it dominated. Japanese pilots didn't fear Hellcats the way infantry fears artillery. They feared them the way you fear inevitability, the way you fear something you cannot stop, cannot escape, and cannot defeat no matter how well you fly or how much courage you possess. Numbers don't lie, but they can obscure. The kill ratio of 19-to-1, the standard statistic thrown around about the Hellcat, is impressive as a bare fact, but doesn't convey the operational reality it represents. Let's do the math. 5,156 Japanese aircraft destroyed by Hellcat pilots in less than 2 years of combat operations. That's 7.3 Japanese aircraft per day, every day from September 1943 to August 1945. 7 aircraft eliminated per day, not as some surge effort, not as a temporary spike during major engagements, but as the sustained average across 24 months. To put that in perspective, the entire Japanese aircraft production for 1944, across all types, bombers, fighters, reconnaissance, trainers, was 28,000 aircraft. The Hellcat force, representing less than 15% of American fighter production, was destroying Japanese aircraft at a rate that would theoretically eliminate their entire annual output in under 11 months. And that's not accounting for all the other American fighters shooting down Japanese planes simultaneously. The mathematics were apocalyptic, but raw kill numbers only tell part of the story. The efficiency with which Hellcats achieved those kills reveals the true dominance. Average ammunition expenditure per kill was approximately 400 rounds, about 1/6 of a Hellcat's total ammunition load. That meant a well-trained Hellcat pilot could, theoretically, down 6 aircraft on a single sortie without reloading. Compare that to European theater averages where pilots often expended thousands of rounds per kill due to deflection shooting and high-speed engagements. And you see how completely Hellcats dominated their tactical environment. They weren't spraying and praying. They were getting close, establishing solid firing solutions, and putting controlled bursts exactly where they needed to be. The gun camera footage from Hellcat kills shows aircraft disintegrating under 2 3-second bursts. That's not luck. That's overwhelming firepower applied with precision. 650 caliber machine guns firing armor-piercing, incendiary rounds don't damage aircraft. They destroy them. Engines seize. Fuel tanks explode. Control surfaces separate. The structural integrity of a Zero or a Betty bomber under sustained 50 caliber fire lasted about as long as a paper target at a shooting range. And unlike rifle caliber or 20mm cannon fire, which might wound or disable, the concentrated volume of fire from 650s simply erased the target from the sky. Survivability statistics complete the picture. Of the approximately 12,300 Hellcats built, operational losses, combat and non-combat combined, totaled approximately 942 aircraft by war's end. That's a loss rate of roughly 7.6% across the entire production run. And most of those losses came from anti-aircraft fire, operational accidents, and kamikaze damage to carriers, not air-to-air combat. In straight fighter versus fighter engagements, the Hellcat loss rate was so low it barely registers statistically. The implication is staggering. America had built a fighter that was essentially immune to its primary opponent. Not resistant, not survivable, immune. A Japanese Zero pilot engaging a Hellcat flown by even a moderately competent pilot had roughly a 5% chance of achieving a kill before being killed himself. Those aren't combat odds. That's suicide with extra steps. And every Japanese pilot knew it. You can see it in their tactical reports from 1944 and 1945, the increasing desperation, the shift to ramming attacks and kamikaze tactics, the acknowledgement that conventional air combat against Hellcat-equipped carrier task forces was pointless. Japan's most experienced ace, Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, with 87 confirmed kills, was shot down and killed by Hellcats in October 1944. If the best pilot Japan produced couldn't consistently defeat Hellcats, what chance did replacement pilots with minimal training have? None. The answer was none. The Hellcat had turned the Pacific Air War into an industrial slaughter, and the only question left by mid-1945 was how long Japan would keep feeding pilots into the grinder before they ran out completely. While the Marianas Turkey Shoot grabbed headlines and the Philippine sea battles became legend, Hellcats were systematically crushing Japanese air power in a dozen other places simultaneously. That's the thing about industrial warfare. The famous battles are just the visible peaks of a much larger operational mountain. The British Fleet Air Arm received 1,100 F6F Hellcats through Lend-Lease, and while their combat record gets less attention than American operations, the results were identical. British Hellcats operating from carriers HMS Indomitable, Victorious, and Indefatigable during operations against Japanese positions in Sumatra and the Andaman Islands reported kill ratios exceeding 20-1. British pilots, many of whom had cut their teeth fighting Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs over Europe, reported the Hellcat made Pacific combat almost boring compared to the knife fight intensity of European operations. The Zero, which Japanese propaganda had built into an invincible weapon, turned out to be target practice for pilots accustomed to aircraft that shot back effectively. Night operations revealed another dimension of Hellcat dominance. The F6F 5N, equipped with and /APS 6 radar in a wing-mounted pod, created America's first truly effective carrier-based night fighter. Japanese bombers had relied on darkness for protection, launching attacks against American task forces in the hours before dawn when carrier fighters couldn't intercept effectively. The night fighter Hellcats ended that tactic permanently. Lieutenant Commander Richard Stambuk, flying from USS Enterprise, developed intercept techniques that allowed Hellcats to hunt Japanese bombers in total darkness, using radar to establish position and closing to visual range before opening fire. His squadron, VFN-9E, shot down 43 Japanese aircraft at night in 6 months without losing a single Hellcat to enemy action. The Japanese response wasn't to adapt. It was to stop flying night missions entirely in areas where night fighter Hellcats operated. That's not a tactical adjustment. That's surrendering an entire operational dimension because you have no counter. And all of this the British operations, the night fighting, the close air support missions over island invasions, was happening simultaneously with the major carrier battles. Hellcats weren't concentrated in one theater or one mission type. They were everywhere, overwhelming Japanese air power through sheer operational ubiquity. By early 1945, Japanese pilots had developed a grim nickname for the Hellcat, Grumman's mower. The reference was to how Hellcat formations would sweep through Japanese defensive positions, cutting down everything in their path with mechanical efficiency. There's a particular incident from the Battle of Okinawa that encapsulates this perfectly. April 16, 1945, a massive kamikaze raid, 185 aircraft, approached the American fleet off Okinawa. The combat air patrol consisted of 74 Hellcats from 3 carriers. In the engagement that followed, Hellcats shot down 93 Japanese aircraft, more than 50% of the attacking force, before a single kamikaze reached the fleet. The remaining aircraft that got through did so not because they defeated the Hellcats, but because there were too many targets and not enough fighters to intercept them all simultaneously. Even in that nightmare scenario, facing overwhelming numbers with suicide mission determination, Hellcats achieved a kill ratio of better than 6-1. The only reason any Japanese aircraft survived to hit ships was mathematical. 74 fighters cannot physically intercept 185 aircraft before some slipped through. But every aircraft the Hellcats engaged died. There's no record of a single Japanese aircraft escaping after a Hellcat established firing position. Not one. The Hellcat's operational dominance by war's end was so complete that Japanese planning documents stopped trying to calculate fighter versus fighter outcomes. They simply assumed that any Japanese aircraft encountering Hellcats would be destroyed and planned accordingly, which mostly meant accepting catastrophic losses as inevitable and hoping kamikaze attackers could close with ships before Hellcats killed them. That's not air combat doctrine. That's fatalism codified into operations orders. The Hellcat had fundamentally broken Japanese military aviation's ability to contest American air superiority, and everyone involved knew it.